Hello, everyone. Welcome to the College Fairs of Greater Denver. This is a panel session titled Financial Aid, Navigating the Financial Aid Maze and Resources. We have our wonderful panelist here, Sierra, to give you all the information on Financial Aid 101. As a reminder, this is a webinar. You are muted. You cannot unmute yourself. If you have any questions, and we encourage you to ask questions throughout the session, please use the Q&A button on your screen to type any questions that you do have. This session is being recorded and will be posted at strivescan.com/Greater Denver. I will now pass it over to Sierra.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sierra Pierce. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a financial aid counselor over at Colorado State University. I'm super excited to be sharing this presentation with you. We're going to do a brief overview, and feel free, like Sarah mentioned, to put in any questions you may have, and then we'll also have time for a designated Q&A at the end of the session. Alrighty, so first I want to start off with a general overview of what we're going to be going over today. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about applying for financial aid and what to expect throughout that process. We're also going to talk about the different types of financial aid that you may be eligible to receive, as well as additional payment options for paying off your university bill. We'll go over what an example of a financial aid offer may look like, and then we'll end with that question and answer session. I also want to emphasize that although I work at Colorado State University, a lot of this information will be applicable to any institutions that you may be looking at. Some of this information will be specific to like Colorado schools, but there's a good breadth of info that you can use during your time. All right. So first off, step one in applying for financial aid is going to be through the FAFSA. The FAFSA stands for the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. Keyword free. There are some companies that may require payment to help walk you through the FAFSA. Any schools that you're applying to, us as financial aid counselors, we're always happy to help. And then the website that you actually apply through, which is studentaid.gov, also has a lot of wonderful resources. So please never pay anyone to complete this application. The thing about the FAFSA it is completed on an annual basis, so it does have to be completed online each year. So if you are currently a senior in high school, you would be applying for the FAFSA this year for your freshman year of college. So this is the application that considers you for grants, loans, and work study funding, and we'll talk about what all of those different components of financial aid mean and what they look like. With the FAFSA, you're going to be filling it out with parent and student tax information from 2 years prior. So if you're applying for financial aid for next academic year, so 2024 to 2025, we're going to be looking at 2022 income information. For our DACA or undocumented students, you would not complete the FAFSA since it is for federal funding. Instead, you would use the CASFA. And that's what we'll go over briefly next. So the CASFA is the Colorado application for state financial aid. Keyword is state. So if you have other, citizenship designations or you fall under those different various populations, this would be the application that you would want to complete. It's super similar to the federal one. It's completed online each and every year. And the big thing I want to emphasize about this is regardless of your citizenship status, this is a safe and confidential application to complete. Again, this is to see if you may be eligible for different forms of institutional, meaning like the college funding based off of financial need. So when looking at how much your family and yourself makes, how much aid we may be able to offer you. If you're looking at any out-of-state schools, the CASFA is something that is specific to the state of Colorado. So any institutions within the state should be able to utilize this. And again, like the FAFSA, we're looking at parent and student tax information from 2 years prior to determine financial need. Now we'll go over some different types of financial aid. So each of the different categories that we may be examining. First and foremost, I want to talk about grant funding. So grant funding is great because this is free money that you don't have to pay back. It's determined by your financial needs. So when we're thinking about the FAFSA or the CASFA, we're looking at your household income to determine how much financial need you have. Lower the income, higher financial need. And in most cases, the more financial aid you would be eligible to receive to help with paying for college. So when you see this EFC, this acronym stands for your expected family contribution. The FAFSA is going to be going through some changes over the coming years. So you may see language like EFC or something similar to it, but it all basically is going back to what is your financial need. The other thing to keep in mind with grant funding is that the maximum amount that you can receive is typically based off of full-time enrollment, which is 12 credits. So if you're taking less than 12 credits, it'll usually be prorated. But again, grant funding is great, free money. This is some more general information about how grants kind of work. So grants, again, it's money that does not have to be repaid. The amount is going to, first and foremost, it can depend on what institution you're applying to, because different colleges will have different amounts of money that they can offer students and pull in from. But the amount is always going to be based off of financial need, cost of attendance, which we'll also talk about a little bit later in this presentation. But cost of attendance essentially is something that every college is going to have. And it's a financial planning tool to determine and kind of give you an idea. Okay, if I'm going to, for example, Colorado State University for 9 months, what is that actually going to cost? And so it gives you a good estimate. So, again, grant funding is based off of financial need, cost of attendance, and then enrollment status. So, how many credits you're taking. To be eligible for grants, you have to be enrolled in an eligible degree. For CSU specifically, we also have CSU Online, which is kind of a separate institution, but under the CSU umbrella. And if you're an online student, unfortunately, you're not eligible for a lot of the Colorado State University grants. So that's one example of what that point may mean. The other piece is maintaining satisfactory academic progress. So this is a federal term that essentially reviews your eligibility for any type of federal funding and usually a lot of grant funding as well. Academic progress, the main things we look at is your GPA and then the percentage of how many classes you're enrolling in that you're completing. The reason we look at this is because we want to make sure that while you're here, you're being successful academically and ultimately working towards that finish line of getting your degree. So if you're not meeting that progress, then we have to do some critical thinking on how we can make sure that you're successful so you're not taking on debt or paying a lot of money for something that may not be fruitful at the end of it. And then you also have to meet credit requirements. This can depend on your major as well as the college that you're attending. All right, I won't go over this in a lot of depth, but I wanted to give you an idea of what these amounts may actually look like. This is one that is going to be specific to CSU. So you can see the amounts, the numbers, if it varies. So these first 3 or 4 here, these are ones specific to Colorado State. So these are institutional grants, meaning because you would be going to CSU, this is what you would be considered for. And then these bottom two here are federal grants. So this is two different types of funding that regardless of what college you go to, whether it's CSU, any school in Colorado, or really any state, if you have financial need, you would be considered for these two. Big thing here is eligibility criteria and selection criteria. So who may be eligible to receive it, as well as what we look at when we are thinking of awarding it to students. So if you're thinking of attending CSU, this might be a good slide to take a picture of. And I'm happy if at the end we need to go back to any, I'm happy to do that as well. All right, next off, we're going to transition into loan funding options. So I wanted to give a brief overview of what this category kind of looks like. So loan funding is borrowed money that you do have to pay back over time. So you are taking on debt with this type of funding. You have to be enrolled in at least 6 credits. So you're thinking half time or more to be eligible for loans. Typically, I would say 95% of the time, federal loan options are going to be a better source of funding than private third-party loan options. A big thing about private loans is that, typically a lot of folks who are coming into college, you're freshly 18, you don't have a lot of credit built up. So when thinking about that, it may be hard to get a good interest rate, and interest rates are really what makes or breaks loans. And you want to get always the loan that has the lowest interest rate so that you can pay it off without it snowballing into something that isn't manageable. So oftentimes students may have to have parents co-sign on it, which means that they're kind of chipping in their name and their credit history in hopes of getting you a better interest rate. That's kind of getting into the nitty gritty of it. But with third party loans, the interest rates can vary a ton based off of your circumstances. So it can be difficult to get a really good competitive interest rate. So typically, we always encourage students to utilize federal loan options first. We'll talk about what those federal loan options will look like next. So first and foremost, we have the direct student loans. So on this bottom right corner, you'll see some annual loan limits. So this basically refers to how much, based off of your enrollment, so if you're a freshman, sophomore, upperclassman, how much you can take out in a given year. Because these loan programs are they have really good terms. There are unfortunately limits to how much you can utilize in this funding source per year. So these are the total amounts that you can take out in a given year. And it is a little bit dependent on what loan program you're using. So for a freshman, for instance, you're eligible for 5,500 per year, and 3,500 of that can be subsidized, and the rest would be made up of unsubsidized loans. So those amounts can vary depending on financial need. Um, but for subsidized loans, those are definitely the more preferable one of the two. The reason for that is because the subsidized one does not accrue interest while you're in school, meaning it will not grow. The unsubsidized loans have the same interest rate, but they do accrue interest while you're in school. For both of these loans, you are not required to start making payments until 6 months after you graduate, or if you were to drop below half time or withdraw from the university you're attending. With that being said, I always say, even if you can put, like, if you have an on campus job or if you have some money saved up, even if you can put $15 a month towards your loans to help while you're in school to keep that interest from growing, it will set you up for success down the line a lot more. Next, we'll talk about the other type of federal loans, and that would be the Federal Parent Plus loan. So for this one, your parent is the borrower and they have to pass a credit check for this loan funding. That's the key difference between this loan and the direct student loans I just mentioned. The direct student loans, the way that you get eligibility for that is by filing the FAFSA. So each and every student who files the FAFSA will have some form of federal loan options available to them in their name. If they need additional funding, that's where this Parent Plus loan comes into play. So the parent is taking it out in their name to cover your cost of education. So for this one, they can start repaying while you're in college, or they can choose to defer payments until after you graduate. The piece with that is it will still accrue interest while you're in school. So it's kind of a question of what would be the best option for you and for your family. And then to apply for this loan, you can also complete this on studentaid.gov. So this is the same website that you do the FAFSA on each year. The parent would apply for that, and usually they find out pretty quick if they got approved for it. The big thing that I think a lot of parents forget, they get that approval and they think they're good to go. But the last step you'd want to do is completing the master promissory note, which is essentially like an online contract saying, I understand it's a loan. I agree to pay it back eventually. All right. Now, the next type of financial aid that I want to touch on is work study funding. So, work study funding is earned money paid via a paycheck through a job. These are on and off campus positions that work around school. So, that's a big, big perk of a work study position is when you have a work study job, your employer knows first and foremost you are a student. So, they'll be more willing to work around different. Um, like if you have an exam, they're more willing to be understanding of that type of thing. I would say, at least at CSU, 90% of our jobs are going to, like our work study positions, are going to be on campus. We have a handful that are off campus, but most of them are on campus, which makes it really convenient and nice for you to be able to work between your classes, and it's in a convenient location often. In some cases, you can also do homework while you're at work. So when I was in college, I worked in financial aid. And when you're checking people in, you're working front desk. If there's downtime, employers are understanding of that. And so it's a really good benefit. The big thing with work study that I want to point out is I think sometimes if they see work study on your award, you think, okay, let's say your award is $5,000. You're like, all right, $5,000 through work study is going to get taken off my bill. Ultimately, though, you are working at this job. So that money is going back to you in the form of a paycheck every 2 weeks, very similar to a normal job that you would get working at Chipotle or working at Target or something like that. So if you're planning on using work study funding to cover your tuition costs, know that you get that check in your pocket and then you have to put it back towards your university bill. So that's always something I like to point out with work study. All right. And then the final type that I want to talk about is another type of free money. So we'll talk about scholarships. So the big thing about scholarships is it is free money, but it's outside of the FAFSA. So hundreds of thousands of dollars are awarded every year via the CSUSA. That acronym stands for the CSU, so Colorado State University Scholarship Application. This would be another good one to take a picture of if you're thinking of applying to CSU for that link right there, financialaid.colostate.edu/scholarships, because you can find information on how to apply for the CSUSA. Now, I've also worked at different state institutions. I've worked at Iowa State University in their financial aid office. And from my personal experience, I would say that most universities that you may be looking at will have their own version of the CSUSA. So it's important to be proactively looking at these applications because for us, for example, at CSU, the CSUSA is similar to the FAFSA in that you would be applying for it now if you're a senior in high school, for next year if you're going to be a freshman in college. So for our personal timeline, the scholarship application will open October 1st, and then you have until March 1st to fill it out. This is the biggest piece of advice I can give you in terms of this timeline to keep in your brain, even if you're a freshman in high school, just to be mindful. Okay, senior year is when I have to start thinking about this because it always breaks my heart when I have students reaching out to me over the summer, right before they're about to start their freshman year of college. And they're like, what scholarships can I apply for? What does CSU offer? And a lot of them are through this big general application. And when the deadline is closed, that window has passed. So, whether it's for CSU or any other institutions that you may be looking at, please, please, please research what scholarship applications they may have through that institution so you can get some eligibility for that. With that being said, I want to chat about the different kinds of scholarships that we offer, that any institution will offer. The first one is merit based. So, this is based off of GPA and academic achievement in high school. So, when you're applying for admissions, the admissions department is usually the ones that will say, okay, this student got a killer GPA in high school. We're going to give them X, Y, and Z scholarship because of their merit and their performance in that sense. The next one is private scholarships. So these are outside of college. These are high schools, organizations, clubs. A lot of times we see folks come in with different private scholarships from their local community, whether it was like a 4-H club that they were involved in or a Rotary club, for instance. The other piece of these is if you search online, just find some scholarship search engines. On our financial aid website, we have some good resources about like reputable scholarship searches for external lenders. That may be a good option to explore, but those would also be private ones. So there are hundreds of thousands of dollars of scholarships floating out there. And I always like to think of it, if you cut out 5 hours a week and you make or you receive a $500 scholarship out of that effort you're putting in, you're literally making $100 an hour going towards your education. So you really get in what you put out of it. And a lot of these will have essay requirements or things like that. Definitely put your all into it because at the end, I promise it will be worthwhile to have, less stress of that financial burden. All right, and then the last one that I want to chat about is institutional aid. So this is scholarships that's specifically offered by colleges and the departments. So the CSUSA, the CSU scholarship application that I was mentioning before, that is for institutional aid. So let's say you are an animal science major and you are doing the CSUSA, you'll get considered for a lot of different departmental scholarships, but also ones for your animal science degree within the College of Agriculture Sciences. So that type of thing. Same goes for a psychology major in the Liberal Arts and Science College. So that's kind of where that piece comes into play and where the CSUSA or the relevant comparable ones from different institutions would look like. All right, next off, I know the screen looks kind of intense, but I wanted to make sure that we go over what you can expect to see on your financial aid offer. So while it may be formatted a little bit differently if you're applying to different schools, it will have a lot of the same content. We won't go over all these numbers super in depth, but again, I'm always happy to go back if you guys have questions about it. First and foremost, I wanted to touch on the cost of attendance a little bit more in depth. I briefly talked about it in the beginning of the presentation, but again, the cost of attendance is a one size fits all budget. So it is a keyword estimate of what your expenses may be for your time at CSU. So the things that go into your cost of attendance is tuition and fees, housing and meals, books and supplies, transportation, and then other educational expenses to cover things that may come up. The big purpose of this form and this layout is so that you can look at this and compare between different schools. Okay, this is how much CU Boulder may cost. This is how much Colorado Springs will cost. This is how much CSU will cost. And get an idea of what you may be able to afford. And then when you look at your financial aid, we can compare it to your cost of attendance to see how much at the end you may be responsible to cover or get loans for. So when we're looking at this example here, It's also important when we're thinking of the cost of attendance to break it down between direct cost and indirect costs. So for direct costs, these are things that will definitively show up on your bill. So your tuition and fees, and if you are living on campus, your housing and meals. Indirect costs are still things that you should budget for, but you're not going to see on your bill. So that would be things like books and supplies, transportation, and other educational expenses. So that gives you your overall estimated cost of attendance. So for a current resident student, this is what we're looking at. Again, this is not necessarily a reflection of your bill, and there's always ways to cut down on these costs, but this is a number that we want folks to keep in mind. The next piece of your financial aid offer is going to be the part that everyone loves to see is what financial aid you're going to be offered. So this is where the grants, the scholarships, the student loans, and work study funding, if available, will be posted. So this is an example of what you as a student may be eligible for. So this is a student with financial need because they have some grant funding here. They have a partnership award, which is similar to another grant that CSU offers. And so this 13.5 number is showing how much this example student is getting in free money. So with that being said, when we take the cost of attendance minus the grants and scholarships, this is going to be how much is left over for the year. And then we have down here a breakdown of the subsidized and unsubsidized loans, as well as a total for how much the student is going to be offered. The last piece will be an estimated bill. So very similar to the cost of attendance, but you'll see your aid actually show up on this section. So it's those direct costs like tuition and fees, if you're living on campus, like your on-campus living expenses, things like that, minus your financial aid. So the reason that this piece is really important is because for this example student that we're going over, it'll show you after your direct costs and your aid has applied, what you will be on the hook for. So in this student's case, the direct cost is $14,000 a semester for a total of $28,000 for the year. They have $13,500 in grants and scholarships. So the estimated bill is going to be $15,000. Then the student may decide to use their federal loans, so that applies. This 9,000 number for this example student would be what would be on the bill that they're responsible to pay. Now you might be looking at that 9,000 number and being like, oh gosh, how do we cover that? That is what we'll go over now. So here are some additional options to pay for college. So first and foremost, you're looking at that $9,000 number for the year. It's about $4,500 per semester. Most schools will have payment plan options. So CSU has one. The earlier you sign up, the better the terms. You don't have interest or anything on it, but it's splitting it into even monthly payments. And so that would be a good option to pursue. Most schools will have them. If you have personal savings, that's also a good route to avoid taking out loans. The next one would be college saving plans, or if your parents put away any money in a 529 plan, that may be a good option to explore too. Earnings from high school and summer jobs. When I was in college, every summer I would go back to my hometown and I worked as a lifeguard and I would save up as much as I possibly could so that I could cover some of my expenses during the year. Personal payments. So if your family or if you kind of like with your savings, if you have anything that you're able to do, you can definitely apply that by the due date. Again, outside private scholarships are going to be another good route to pursue and put some time and energy into applying for those. Then we have those federal student and parent loans that we talked about earlier. And then if there's still a gap in funding left over after that, you can also pursue those alternative or third party student loans with a cosigner. So those are all different options to kind of make up what may be left over. Oftentimes, it is loans that people will utilize. I know no one wants to hear that loans may be the best option to pursue, but ultimately, it may be worthwhile to make up that difference. And we're always happy to chat about different options. If you come in with your families, if you're visiting campus, we can always talk about your guys' personal situation and what may be best suited for you. All righty. Well, that wraps up most of the content that I had to go over with you today. With that being said, I wanted to leave time to do a question and answer session at the end. I know I went over a ton of information. I see one question pending in our Q&A, so I'll be sure to get to that. Feel free to put in any questions you may have. I want to emphasize that this process is not intuitive. Financial aid is very overwhelming and it's very confusing. And I was a first generation student, and I always like to disclose that because when I was going through college, I had no idea what I was doing. And I say that to hopefully provide some comfortability and space for you guys to answer or ask any questions that you may have, because I think that this is definitely the space and the time to do that. So I will definitely be reviewing those as they come in. So feel free to pop them in, and I'm also happy to go back to any slides that we may need. Okay, so first one is from a parent. They're asking, are these estimated bills going to look the same for non-citizens? Yes. So the tuition rate is going to be the same. Um, oh, it says Sarah. Do you want to pop in on this one too?
No, I'm just clicking answer live in the system. No worries.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, so for non-citizens, the bill amount is going to look the same. You'll still be assessed the same rate of tuition. If you're a non-resident of the state, then you'll be charged non-resident tuition, but the bill won't be increased if you're not a citizen of the states. What I will say is that your financial aid options may be a little bit more limited. So the CASFA is definitely something that you'd want to pursue, and then maybe looking into like a lot of different institutions will have international student offices on campus, and they provide resources as well. So that gives you a good starting point. All righty. Another question from a parent. How does the December deadline for FAFSA affect how colleges make offers to students? Not deadline. Let's see here. How does the December... So are you asking, Pamela, about the FAFSA opening a little bit later this year? Because typically, historically, it has opened in October, but this year it's going to be opening in December. Was that what you were referencing? Okay, yes. All right. So I mentioned earlier that the FAFSA is kind of undergoing a transformation right now. So the Department of Education, for the first time in many decades, is kind of revamping the FAFSA. With that being said, they're still finalizing a lot of the changes that are being made to the application. So instead of the FAFSA opening in October, it will be opening in December. I can't speak as to how that may, like other institutions may handle that shift, but here at CSU, our schedule, our timeline won't look a ton different. The way that we package our students at CSU is we don't do it on a first come, first serve basis. If you have financial need, as long as we receive your FAFSA before the start of the academic year, so even if you file it in January of your student's senior year of high school, and then we have it and everything's all set, as long as we receive it by the time they start their freshman year and they're enrolled, I would say you'd have full consideration for grant funding and things like that. Um, in terms of early action offers, at CSU, it's usually we just look at their financial need and then award them the most that they're eligible to receive. Since it's not first come, first serve in terms of how our office approaches it, that's kind of our overarching approach. I hope I answered that question well. Pamela, if you have more questions, feel free to drop that back in the Q&A. All righty. So a question from a counselor: for Colorado students planning to go to school in state, they need to complete both the CASFA and the FAFSA, correct? So you only really need to do one. The CASFA, I can go back to those pages too. Let's see here. These are all really, really good questions. Bear with me while I go all the way back. Okay, so the CASFA is specifically for students who have different like citizenship statuses. So this application is primarily for undocumented or DACA students. So with this one, that would be the only real population that would need to do it. For a citizen of the United States who's a resident of Colorado, they would just need to do the FAFSA. So it's usually one or the other. For CASFA students who are eligible to complete this, the reason this is here is because they're not eligible for federal funding, so they wouldn't be able to do the FAFSA. Whereas someone who is eligible for federal funding would only need to do the FAFSA. They don't have to do the CASFA. All right. Next question from another parent. When will we know how much financial aid is offered? So typically for us at CSU, once you file your FAFSA, it takes maybe, I would say, 2 weeks or so from the point that we receive it to process it. And then it can take an additional 2 weeks for us to get you your financial aid offer. So, the biggest piece of advice I can give you is to file your FAFSA or your CASFA as soon as you can, as soon as you're able to, once those open. So, again, the FAFSA this year is set to open December 1st. So, file it sooner rather than later. That way, you can compare all of your options, especially if you're going to be applying to multiple different schools, because you ultimately want to see which school is giving me the most money, which school is the best fit, which school makes the most sense for the student's educational goals. So it's typically a pretty fast process. What I would say is if you've done your FAFSA and a couple weeks have gone by and you're like, where is my financial aid offer? Feel free to always give the school a call. We are always happy to check on the status of your application, give you guys an update and a timeline on what to expect on when to receive your award. Sometimes there may be things that hold up processing, so it's always good to be proactive and talking with each school about when you'll receive that offer once it's processed. Alrighty, next question. You said FAFSA, they're citizens. What about if they are permanent legal immigrants, green card holders? So green card holders are also eligible to apply for the FAFSA. It's mainly, particularly the CAFSA is for undocumented or DACA recipients. So if you're a green card holder, absolutely, you're still eligible to do the FAFSA. And studentaid.gov is the website you do the FAFSA on. They have a lot of information about if I have blank citizenship status, what category would I fall under and would I be eligible to receive that funding? Alrighty, next question. What can you do as a junior to be ready for this process? That's a really good question. I think it's never too early to start thinking about what schools you may want to seriously consider. And I think juniors are in a good spot because they can start exploring what schools they may want to go to. And the biggest thing that I would recommend is exploring the schools that you're looking at, exploring each of their financial aid websites. Because, for instance, CSU has their general scholarship application, like I mentioned, but there's very specific timelines in which you can submit that application. So I think just making sure that you're aware of what timelines things have to be submitted when. And again, whatever schools you're looking at, that particular financial aid office would probably be the best to contact directly for making sure you're on the right track. It's never too early to reach out to us, and we're always happy to provide help. But I think the best thing you can do is proactively looking at, okay, when do these things need to be received? Because I think, you know, that's what hurts me as a financial aid counselor is seeing folks who have financial need or who really want to come to CSU but they've missed out on deadlines and therefore they aren't eligible to even be considered for certain types of aid. So just knowing when things are due when is probably going to be the best to get you set up for success. Alrighty, it looks like there's a bit of got one more. Are legal immigrants eligible for any of the financial aid discussed? Absolutely. So if you have a legal like citizenship status, then you would be doing the FAFSA. And so you would be eligible to be considered for all forms of federal financial aid. On the topic of citizenship, I think that it's also important to mention for students who may have full citizenship in the States, but if your parents are undocumented, one thing that I've seen that kind of catches people off guard is even if you as the student have citizenship, your parents would not be eligible to apply, for instance, for the Parent Plus loan, which is a form of federal funding. So if your parents have an undocumented status, they wouldn't be eligible for that form of funding. I wanted to make sure I mentioned that. All right, next question. This is perhaps a very subjective question. What if the last 2 years of taxes reflect a much higher income due to an unusual circumstance, and the present year going forward is not what the parents or is what the parents' income would be? That's a really, really good question. So part of the mindset behind using taxes from 2 years ago at this point should surely be filed at that point. Whereas 1 year passed, they may have tax extensions, things like that. And especially after COVID, we know that a ton can change in 2 years. So if for any reason the income has changed, your family circumstances have changed, if there's, God forbid, a loss of a parent or a divorce or things like that, aside from even, maybe a job loss or whatnot, definitely reach out to all of the financial aid offices for the schools you're applying to, because we can do what's called a professional judgment appeal. So we would basically ask for documentation of what has changed since your taxes 2 years ago. That way we can use that information to update your current financial information. um, so much can change in 2 years that we want to make sure that you are currently being assessed for what is accurate to your household. So, with that being said, we'll go through and update it to make sure that it is more reflective of what your current financial situation is, to ensure that your student is considered for the most aid possible. That's a really, really good question. Okay, next question. If parents aren't on the H-1B and student is on H-4 EAD students and they're waiting for the green card, are students still eligible for financial aid, or do they apply as an international student? If you are waiting for your green card, which, if you guys are familiar with the process, can take years. It can take a very, very long time for that. So if you're still waiting for the green card, unfortunately, they would be applying as an international student. Once you have that green card and you are an official citizen, then you can apply for the FAFSA. But unfortunately, if you are still going through that process, then you would be considered an international student in that case. All right, next question. Same thing applies if you have more than one kid in college. This is the personal finance aid appeal question. Okay, so this is one of the changes that is coming in the next year's FAFSA. So historically, um, if you have more than one child in college at a time, the FAFSA will basically split your expected family contribution. So if the Department of Education says, okay, this person makes $100,000 a year, they can contribute $8,000 to my student's education. If you have two kids in college, then that $8,000 would be split for each student. So 4,000 and 4,000, which was good because you would get more consideration for like need-based aid. One part of the FAFSA and the Department of Education changing the FAFSA and simplifying the process is that they would no longer be looking at how many are in college at a given point in time in terms of how they're calculating the family household income. So that is something that's determined by the FAFSA. You wouldn't need to appeal for it, but they are actively changing the regulation on that. I would direct you to the studentaid.gov website, because they're posting a lot of resources about what is changing on the FAFSA, and that would be a good place to check out as well. All right. What scholarships are dependent on SAT scores? So each institution, when we're thinking about merit-based scholarships, may have different like thresholds for what they're awarding students. At CSU, we do not require students to have a certain SAT score. We really look at their GPA. Um, Sarah, if it would be helpful, I think I'm going to try to stop sharing so that I can open up a web browser and show folks on our website where to access some of these
Sure,
things.
no problem.
Bear with me, folks. While I'm doing this, feel free to send more questions. You all are asking great ones. Alrighty, I wanted to share my screen real quick. Sarah, can you see the CSU financial aid website right now?
Yes, you are sharing the right screen.
Perfect. Thank you for that confirmation. So this is our main homepage. A lot of this information, most of it will be specific to CSU, but it gives you a good starting point in terms of what to look at and what to look for when you're looking at different institutions. So for merit-based scholarships, if we go ahead and click on our scholarship page, and we're all from the Denver area, so we're going to look at ones for Colorado residents. This kind of breaks down some of what you may see at different institutions. So for us, we're going to look at GPA is 4.0 or higher. So this one is a very competitive merit-based scholarship. You've demonstrated satisfactory completion of courses, and again, you meet some of the like eligibility requirements for the scholarship, so being full-time and a degree-seeking students in the main campus. So this is something that would be the cutoff. We don't usually look at test scores, at least at CSU. All right, another question here. So, as an international student and student being a resident of Colorado for more than 5 years, are they eligible for in state tuition or international student tuition fees? So, you would be assessed as a essentially, it kind of depends on how you're applying for your admissions. So, they would apply as a resident, particularly if they graduated from a high school in Colorado, then that would be one of the big caveats that would ensure that they're designated as a resident. International status really has to do with what age or what aid they're eligible to receive. But in terms of their residency status, that's more so based off of the length of time they've lived in the state. And a big one that's designated right away is if they've graduated from a Colorado high school. If you're applying to CSU, your admissions counselor would also be a really good resource to ask some of those questions about as well. Alrighty, well, I think we've reached a lull in questions. Keep them coming if you all are wondering anything else. We have one more here. Is there a set income cutoff for receiving aid? It's really hard for me to answer that question because while there isn't necessarily a set cutoff, we go off of, well, I suppose there is. I can't give you an exact number without going in depth in some federal calculations, but the FAFSA is what determines how much financial need a family has. So there's a lot of calculations that go into that federal aid application to determine, okay, based off of how much they make, how much could these parents contribute? It's not necessarily what you're on the hook for, but just a number to determine financial need. Based off of that calculation, what that EFC is, or next year it'll be called a student aid index. What you may be receiving there is what that number is what will be determined for your aid offer. So I feel like that was kind of a non-answer, and I apologize for that. But it really depends on the information reported on the FAFSA. There's no like hard deadline, like if you make over 125, then you're not getting anything. It really can depend on the situation. Alrighty, well, let's see here. Oh, we got another. Okay. Do you suggest reaching out for outside help when filling out the FAFSA? Um, it really depends. I mean, I think the website, so studentaid.gov is a really, really good website. They have a lot of like drop boxes that you can click on. Like some of the questions may not be the most straightforward. So you can click for more information on exactly how to answer that question. There's also helplines. So numbers that you can call on studentaid.gov to get some of those questions answered and speak to an actual human. And the other thing I would recommend is contacting the financial aid offices of the institutions that you're potentially thinking of applying to. Um, like I mentioned before, the FAFSA, first and foremost, is free. There are companies that will advertise that they will help you and your family in filing that FAFSA for a fee. Please don't ever pay someone for that. It is a free resource to see what you may be eligible for and to provide sources of funding. You should never have to pay someone for that. I really want to emphasize that and drive that piece home. All right. If a student goes out of state, is there a way to establish residency during the first year of college, like using a grandparent's address, for example, for in state tuition the following years? That's a good question. Residency is really, really tricky, particularly in the state of Colorado. The state legislature is some of the strictest across the country in terms of establishing residency for the purposes of receiving in state tuition. Unfortunately, like if you just were to use a family member's address, that does not equate being able to establish residency and get that in-state tuition rate. The requirements are pretty strict on what a eligible petitioner would be to establish residency in the state. So the first one would be to either be 23 years old and showing that you have established domicile in the state of Colorado, meaning they have lived here on their own, they're able to provide that documentation. If they have a car, they would want to make sure that that's insured in the state of Colorado, that the car is in their name, showing like pay stubs of them working in the state and being able to provide that information. So the age requirement is what unfortunately gets a lot of students because most students are coming in, again, they're freshly 18, so they may not be able to meet that age requirement. The big way around that if you're under the age of 23 at the point when you're trying to petition for residency, is you would need to show that you are financially emancipated. When I say emancipated, I think parents their ears click on that one. And so that is I want to separate legal emancipation for financial emancipation for the purposes of residency. So, if a student is under the age of 23 and they're petitioning, they would need to show financial emancipation, essentially indicating that they are completely financially independent of their parents, of family members, and they're not receiving any external support. Again, that's really hard for an 18-year-old sometimes to be able to show. So again, they're paying all of their own expenses. They're not receiving any help. A big one is if they're still on your health insurance, then they wouldn't be able to petition on that front. Sarah, how are we doing on time?
We can take one final question that has been put in the chat, and then we will need to wrap it up.
Alrighty, perfect. So I heard that Arizona is a reciprocal state. Does it mean that financial aid applied for in Colorado is valid there? So reciprocity between states actually refers to the in-state versus out-of-state tuition rate. So if you are applying to a school in Arizona and you're a resident of Colorado, then you would be assessed a lower rate of tuition than a outside, like a out-of-state student from like Pennsylvania would. It doesn't necessarily mean that the aid you would be eligible for here is applicable anywhere else. But it has more so to do with the rate of tuition that you'd be assessed. That's a good question. Well, thank you all so much for engaging with me today. I showed you our website. We have our contact information on there as well. Feel free to email us, call us, pop into the office if you're thinking of applying to CSU, and we're happy to answer your questions. Thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you so much for joining in. Thank you to Sierra for a wonderful presentation. As a reminder, the recording will be posted at strivescan.com/Greater Denver. And we do have more sessions coming up, so feel free to check back to the website for more. Thank you so much.